Hi, good afternoon, everyone. This is Kira Zedelman with NARUC. This is the webinar on tax credits for carbon capture and storage, an update on Treasury guidance. Welcome, thanks for joining us. To kick things off, I think we have Commissioner Jeremy Oden of the Alabama Public Service Commission and Chair of the NARUC Subcommittee on Clean Coal and Carbon Management. Commissioner?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you, Kiara, for setting all this up, and we were very interested in our today's topic. Well, let's just go ahead and get into it. I'd like to just say this is about, the carbon capture and storage credits, the 45Q. In February of 2018, bipartisan budget expanded tax credits for the carbon capture and utilization and storage, known as the 45Q, from their place within the Internal Revenue Code. The 45Q credits are a crucial stepping stone to making CCUS projects financially viable. However, the law left many details to the IRS and to address in the guidance. The Tax Cuts and the Jobs Act kept the IRS busy for much of the last 18 months. But the IRS issued notice on 2019-32 in early of May of this year to kick off the guidance process. Today, we are joined with several different people who will be talking about these and on the webinar, and they will actually be talking about the 45Q and the tax policy. And these experts are very knowledgeable of the subject, so let me introduce them to you this morning. Michael Plattner is the Senior Tax Counsel at Van Ness and Feldman, where he provides strategic counsel on legal, legislative, and regulatory issues, including tax, energy, and international trade. Prior to joining Van Ness and Feldman in 2010, Michael was the tax director at the American Petroleum Institute and tax and trade counsel for Senator John Chafee. Also joining is Hunter Johnson, he is a partner at Steptoe & Johnson, LLP, where he has represented clients before Congress and the executive branch on energy and other issues. Hunter recently led the Carbon Capture Coalition's effort to rewrite the 45Q tax credit and advises clients on how energy legislation impacts their businesses. Finally, Lisa Zarlinger is a partner at Steptoe & Johnson, LLP, representing public and private companies on federal income tax issues and assisting clients in advocacy on tax policy issues before the Treasury Department and before the IRS. Before joining the firm, Lisa served as tax legislative counsel at the Treasury Department. We are so proud to have all of you in our conversation today, and we're interested in your topics and how you will present yourselves, and also on the 45Q. Let me ask this to save all your questions, if you don't mind, until all three of these get through presenting their presentations. And then we'll open it up for questions. If you're on the app, that is a little hand button, or at the bottom it actually has a little question thing. You can touch that, or you can see Kiera. If you want to give them any other instructions, you can. We're looking forward to it, and thank you for joining us, and we'll get right on into our presentations.
Thank you, Commissioner Oden. This is Michael Plattner, and thank you to the NARUC staff as well for putting this together. We appreciate the opportunity to be with you today and present some more background information for you on 45Q and the regulatory process and the guidance that we hope will be forthcoming very soon. So during my part of the presentation, I know that you all have had a couple of webinars, I think last year, shortly after the bill was enacted, but we want to give you a little bit, I just want to do a sort of another brief overview of the changes and why some of those changes were made, because that sort of leads into some of the things reasons that we need some of the guidance that we're going to be looking for. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So first, this really is just to give you kind of a brief picture of what CO2 emissions look like in the United States. As you can see from this slide, the electricity production side of the industrial facilities provides almost 70% of the CO2 emissions in the United States right now, at least as in 2017. And that has not changed much since 2017, if any. Coal-fired power plants are the bulk of that, followed by natural gas-fired power plants. So 45Q is very important to trying to get carbon sequestration, carbon capture and storage into commercialization for power plants if we want to reduce CO2 emissions in the country. Next slide, please. This slide just gives you a little background as well on sort of the cost, first of a kind cost for CCUS based on different industries. If you look at this chart, sort of natural gas processing on the far left, that red bar, which is, not about 10 million tons of CO2 a year from a basic natural gas processing plant. That's fairly inexpensive to do because they're having to separate that CO2 from the natural gas stream that's coming out of the ground before they can, ship the methane, put the methane into a pipeline. So they're already stripping the CO2. Now they just have to add the equipment to actually capture it and move it somewhere else. And then the costs go up from there as for different kinds of capture units and as well the size of those capture units. As you can see on the far right, when you get to power plants, whether those are coal or natural gas fired power plants, and you're into the 500 million tons per year range, that the costs are estimated to be almost $60 a ton. Well, right now, CO2 used for enhanced oil recovery is probably selling for less than $15 a ton because of the current price of oil. So there's really no incentive from a cost point of view to be able to do this. So the 45Q tax credit at $50 a ton for CO2 just stored for saline storage, or $35 a ton with EOR, is getting you closer to sort of that break-even point. So that really shows you the importance, I think, of why we need the tax credit. Next slide. This just gives you a few points on sort of why carbon capture hasn't been deployed so far in very many power plants. As you know, we do have there are two plants in North America at this point running that are coal-fired that are capturing the CO2. One in Texas, and then there's one in Canada as well. Both of those projects were done, had a lot of government funding as part of doing those, and showed that it can be done. And now we just have to try to get the cost down in order to get there. As you know, wind and solar has had 30 to 40 years of support from the federal government, and so the 45Q tax credit is really going to hopefully provide, at least for a short period of time, the kind of incentive that will be necessary to get to these carbon capture technology to a point where it can be commercial scale at a reasonable cost. So the original 45Q tax credit, which was enacted in 2008, had a 75 million ton cap on the total amount of CO2 that could be captured and receive the credit. As a result of that cap, projects could not rely on the credit when they were trying to put together their financing structures and lay out how they were going to pay for this project. So because there was no guarantee that they were ever going to get any credits. As of the end of 2017, about 60 million tons of CO2 have been captured under the old credit. Most of that has come from natural gas processing plants that were already separating and capturing that CO2, but were able to qualify under the old credit. As a result, groups like the Carbon Capture Coalition that Hunter worked with and the Carbon Utilization Research Council that I work with, we're working together to try to come up with changes for 45Q that could make it more effective. So some of those changes, as you can see on this slide, that we talked about, was converting it to a production tax credit, much like the wind PTC, so that you actually get $1 per ton credit. Once you qualify, you're going to get that for a 12-year period, which is very important to being able to put the value of that credit into your financing package and help you get to financial close so you can do the project. The way the credit was designed at this point, you have to commence construction on a project by January 1, 2024, which was about 6 years when this was enacted back in 2018, but we're now almost a year and a half later, and still we're sort of waiting. We're waiting for guidance, and we hope that with the request for comments that was issued back in May, and the comment deadline of July 4th, that the comments that have been received, the IRS will be able to take those and put out the guidance that Hunter and Lisa will be talking about shortly. As I said before, the credit claim period is 12 years. The $35 and $50 ton amounts are actually escalated. They don't happen immediately, so it phases up over a period that began back in 2017 and is fully phased in 2025. So once we get to 2025, we will have the $35 and $50 ton rates. From there, those credits will then be indexed for inflation and will continue to increase beyond that. Next slide. A few other changes. Besides just doing carbon capture on industrial facilities, the bill added direct air capture as another possibility for qualifying for the credit. And direct air capture, while it is an incredibly expensive technology because of the density, or lack of density, I should say, of CO2 actually in the atmosphere, that it takes, it's very expensive to try to do that. There are some initial projects that are out there trying to test various equipment to do that. And the 45Q credit being eligible for those may help some of those projects get moving as well. Another big change was the transferability provision. The credit can be transferred from the owner of the capture equipment to the party that injects the CO2 into the ground or utilizes the CO2. That has provided sort of an opportunity for projects to be developed that have a carbon capture owner investing in a project may be able to use some or all of the credits. If they can't use all of the credits, then they can effectively sell those credits to the entity, let's say for enhanced oil recovery, the oil and gas company that's doing the injection of the CO2 and producing the oil. They could sell those credits to that person as really part of the price of selling them the CO2. So it just gives them another opportunity to monetize that credit and make it and get full value for it to the owner of the capture equipment. The next point on that talks about the fact that the carbon capture owner is now the person that qualifies for the credit. Under the old 45Q, it was the owner of the industrial facility, which the recommendation was that we change that to the owner of the capture equipment so that you could bring in really third-party developers that would be able to look at projects and put together a capture project and not just someone that had to own the actual underlying facility. So it's very unlikely, especially for large electric generating units, that the owners of those would be interested in bringing in partners to help own the facility, whereas they can bring in a third party now to own the capture equipment and qualify for the credit. So that was very helpful to the process. And then the next thing was to reduce the capture requirements. So the old 45Q credit was 500,000 tons of CO2 a year for all industrial facilities. In order to bring in more facilities to be eligible, they left it at 500,000 for electric generating units, but reduced it to 100,000 tons for other industrial emitters, and added a third category of 25,000 tons required for pilot projects where the CO2 that's captured will be utilized. It would be part of a utilization project where it's used for either through chemical conversion or something else to make other products out of that CO2. Next slide. So timing, we've already talked really about the commenced construction date, that you have to have it started construction by 2024. That's going to be a big issue for the regulatory guidance that we're going to be, Lisa and Hunter will be talking about as well. The big thing for this is that carbon capture projects are much larger industrial projects and much more expensive than a wind or a solar farm. And so as a result, the rules that the Treasury puts forth are going to be very important to those projects to make sure that they can qualify, because the lead times to permit and develop these kind of projects are much longer than for a wind or solar project. So that 2024 deadline is going to be a very hard target to meet. So we're going to need guidance that really helps these projects qualify down the road. Next slide. A little bit on the sort of environmental impacts of the 45Q tax credits. According to the GCCSI, the United States is currently capturing about 30 million tons of CO2 a year. That is, as you can tell from the slide back when we talked about the amount of CO2 that's being emitted, there is a huge source of CO2 from industrial facilities, especially electric generating units. So we expect with 45Q that you can easily double or triple what's currently being captured, and maybe more if the guidance is there that's proper. And that as well, according to the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they said that direct air capture is going to be a real one of the things that's going to be really required in order to get to the 2-degree scenario that they have put forward. And so the fact that direct air capture was added to the credit is another big issue for purposes of reducing the CO2 emissions that we need to reduce in this country. Next, on economic impacts, there were some studies done after the 45Q credit bill the Future Act was enacted last year. As you can see here, for the utilization markets, there's an estimate of about $1 trillion in new domestic CO2 products markets, and about $5.9 trillion globally. So there is a market out there, and it really is a matter of getting it to the point where you can get that CO2 capture at commercial scale. As well, another study was done by Kirk and ClearPath on what it would take to sort of commoditize carbon, and how you could make it a commodity that can be out there and sold in the marketplace. So they estimate that in doing that through the 45Q tax credit and through enhanced oil recovery and other types of utilization, that you could create somewhere between 270,000 and 780,000 new jobs, and increase GDP by about $65 to $190 billion over the next few years. So there is a big market for this, and it could really go a long way towards helping the U.S. economy and help address CO2 emissions as well. Investment impacts. This credit, we're really seeing a lot of interest now from financial institutions out there who have for years been looking at the wind credit, the solar credits, and they're now taking a hard look at the 45Q credit, whether they never would have considered it in the past. The guidance, again, the guidance from IRS and Treasury is going to be very important to provide some insurance to those financial markets in order to help them get comfortable with this credit and how it's going to work, and that projects will be able to get qualified and will actually earn those credits. So we believe that that was done with the renewables markets. We believe that it can happen with the 45Q credit as well, and that those markets will come along, and that you'll see new investment vehicles out there and new types of financial products that can be utilized to help finance those projects. So as they move forward, that they're going to be looking very carefully at what the Treasury and IRS guidance says. Just a couple of final points on sort of other legislation that's out there right now to look at the helping carbon capture. If you can go to the next slide. So right now, the Department of Energy has a fossil energy loan guarantee program that has been around for a lot of years. There's becoming more interest in that again to be able to try to go to DOE and get some government grants to help put together carbon capture projects. DOE is beginning to look more at that as well, again, for grants and loans. As well as there's some other legislation. There's the Enhancing Fossil Fuel Energy Carbon Technology Act, which is a bill to provide sort of more authorizations to the Department of Energy to do more R&D on clean technologies, what kind of new technologies can come up with to reduce emissions from both coal and natural gas power plants. The next one is the Launching Energy Advancement Through Innovations in Natural Gas, the Leading Act, which it directs the Department of Energy to conduct critical carbon capture research and development for natural gas power plants. Some members of Congress have felt like a lot of the focus has been on coal-fired power plants, so this bill was introduced to try to as well get DOE to spend some more money on natural gas-fired power plants. Both of these bills are being marked up as part of a package of about over 20 bills that the Senate Energy Committee will be considering tomorrow. We expect that the committee will approve it, and then just have to see what happens with it once they move forward from there. The next one is the Use It Act, Utilizing Significant Emissions with Innovative Technologies. That's a bill that's been introduced the last couple of years that's really trying to help galvanize building of CO2 pipelines to help transport pipelines from where power plants are located, where that CO2 is captured, to locations where it can be utilized. Then another one is the Carbon Capture Monetization Act, which is one that's modifies a different tax credit that's out there for coal-fired power plants to try to provide some additional incentive for carbon capture on coal-fired power plants. So that bill has not, at this point, has several co-sponsors in both the House and Senate, but we're sort of waiting for a tax legislative vehicle to move for that to go forward. And lastly, on the next slide, the two other bills, the Financing Our Future Energy Act, which is another tax bill that would allow master limited partnerships, which is a type of investment vehicle that has been used a lot in the oil and gas industry, that MLPs could now invest in carbon capture projects. And the other one is the Carbon Capture Improvement Act, which would expand private activity bonds, which are issued by state and local governments to provide low-cost financing to private businesses to allow those to be issued on behalf of carbon capture projects as well. So those are just sort of two new financing mechanisms that folks are looking for legislation to approve. That's it for my part of the presentation. To give you that sort of background, I'd now like to turn it over to Hunter and Lisa and let them walk through where we are in the guidance process. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Michael. This is Hunter Johnson. I'm here with my partner Lisa Zarlinga, and we've been asked to provide an overview of Notice 2019-32 from the Department of Treasury, which was a request for comments related to implementation of the Future Act 45Q changes that occurred last year. Next slide, please. So the notice is essentially a request for comments by the Treasury and the Internal Revenue Service on key issues related to changes in the mostly related to changes that were adopted in the 2018 Bipartisan Budget Act. The issues for which they were seeking comments include the transfer provision, which is not completely unique in the tax code, but there are some unique features of the 45Q transfer provision. The definition of secure geologic storage, which is the basic test for what you must do with the CO2 once you've captured it in order to get the tax credit. Also, the issue of recapture is one which, even though that's been in the 45Q statute since 2009, the recapture rules have not been established, and so that's something that taxpayers want guidance for. In addition, the Treasury Department asked whether there should be some clarification with respect to beginning of construction in order to meet the 2024 test. Also, there are two other items that were covered in the notice, including something that's known as the economic substance doctrine and partnership allocations, which really go to the heart of what a taxpayer must do to meet the test that they're at risk for the underlying business of what the tax credit is being used for. And then finally, there's a new question related to utilization of CO2, if you're not just using it in secure geologic storage and you're utilizing the CO2 in some beneficial way through the production of materials or in agro farming or something, that there be a test which we'll discuss here in a subsequent slide. Next slide, please. So under transfer, basically, they ask for comments on the types of contractual arrangements that investors would anticipate between the parties who are going to be involved in this business. And you can see from the slide what the exact questions were, including whether the common terms of the contracts for disposal of CO2 or use of CO2 as a tertiary injectant refers to enhanced oil recovery. What are the minimum standards for which ought to be contained in contracts, for instance? What factors should be considered regarding time and manner of the election to transfer the credit? In other words, how often it could be done, maybe multiple times in the 12-year period, maybe annually, maybe multiple times in any 1 year. And if an election is made, what are the rules regarding the transfer? Next.
I would just add real quick on the transfer provision. Hunter mentioned that it's not unheard of in the tax area, but it is relatively unusual. Most of the credit provisions do not have transfer provisions. And so this is a really key feature of 45Q and the changes that were made by the Bipartisan Budget Act to enable eligible transferees actually use the credit when the capturer or the owner of the equipment doesn't have a tax liability with which to use the credit. So that's just something to keep in mind. And there will be, a number of structures and partnerships and lease arrangements and contractual arrangements that develop around that transfer provision.
That's right. That's a very important point. And so, as Commissioner Odom referred to and Michael mentioned, we were involved with the Carbon Capture Coalition in getting the legislation passed initially, and we also represented the coalition and in providing model guidance to the Treasury and also in answering some of these questions with respect to the notice. So just for purposes of this this webinar, we've included some of the Carbon Capture Coalition recommendations with respect to how the Treasury should look at this and providing suggestions to the Treasury with respect to implementation. So the Carbon Capture Coalition did recommend that the Treasury adopt a very flexible set of rules regarding credit transferability, including annual transfer elections and partial transfers of the tax credit. That model guidance also provides that if a carbon capture project contractually assures that a specified activity is carried out, that it can do so in a way where the party does it either themselves or gets contractual assurance that that party is going to do the activity. So this concept of contractual assurance was part of the original law, and it was embedded in the revisions that were adopted in 2018. And that flexibility to be able to transfer it to the party that contractually ensures the disposal of the CO2 in secure geologic storage provides an element of flexibility with respect to the tax equity type of structure that might be structured around a carbon capture 45Q transaction. So that element of flexibility is very important because, after all, this is a tax credit, so we're talking about being able to monetize the tax credit, as Lisa mentioned, with someone with tax liability. So next slide, please. Secure geologic storage, this can get rather technical, but basically the question about meeting the terms of secure geologic storage, it more or less includes a requirement that there be a monitoring and verification plan that's associated with a Class 2 or a Class 6 permit. That this is a regulatory feature of the Safe Drinking Water Act. The form refers to the IRS form, but essentially what that means is that MRV plan, what it does is it's an accounting mechanism and a monitoring mechanism for what happens to the CO2 once it is sequestered in a geologic formation. And so the basic criteria that the Internal Revenue Service has adopted is that there be an MRV plan that is also, if you see here that there's a reference to subpart RR, the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program, the minimum requirement, subpart RR includes the MRV requirement. Class 6 includes MRV as a feature of the permit. Class 6 is essentially a non-EOR geologic sequestration classification under the Safe Drinking Water Act. So the notice did ask some specific questions relative to this issue of secure geologic storage, including whether there is additional technical criteria that should be adopted that's in addition to the EPA's greenhouse gas reporting plan. And they also asked if there were different approaches that are already existing, such as those developed by the ISO, which is the International Organization for Standardization, that should go, that are equivalent to RR reporting that would include this MRV plan, and whether, and so comments were asked very specifically with respect to whether there ought to be some alternate pathways or guidelines, standards, regulations that should also govern the definition of what should be concluded as secure geologic storage. Next slide, please.
No, actually, go back one slide. I think they were ahead one.
Oh, you guys were ahead one.
Yeah, that's good right there.
Okay, recapture, right. Sorry. So the element of recapture is it's sort of easy to understand the concept, a little more technical with respect to the tax code. But essentially, recapture deals with what happens if the CO2 does not remain in secure geologic storage and what should be the rules in connection with that. And so the notice asks for what should be the standard for triggering and measuring recapture, and how should the recapture of the benefit of the credits relate to the requirements of 45Q, and this element of secure geologic storage.
And one of the complexities here from a tax perspective is, you know, you report your liability year to year, and so you're going to be taking the credit for 12 annual periods, and if some of the CO2 leaks and you have a recapture event, how far back do you have to go and recompute your tax liability? The normal statute of limitations is 3 years, and I think some commenters had suggested that there be a 3-year limit on that. And as Hunter will discuss, I think the Carbon Capture Coalition took a different approach.
Well, the Carbon Capture Coalition really wanted to, and we're going to the next slide, please. They were really substantially concerned over the element of enhanced oil recovery, and if you were going to claim the credit in connection with enhanced oil recovery, what should be the minimum standard. And the Carbon Capture Coalition achieved a consensus around the notion that if you had an MRV program embedded in subpart RR or an equivalent program, then you ought to get a safe harbor under the recapture rules. And essentially what the safe harbor is structured around is this idea that in an MRV plan, you're using a mass balance accounting standard to determine whether you've injected more CO2 well, determine the amount that has been injected and the amount of leakage, if any, that has occurred. And essentially on a mass balance basis, you can determine whether you're net positive or not. And so the safe harbor was constructed around a notion that in any 2-year period, if you're net negative, there would be recapture, but if you were net positive, it would essentially retire the tax credit of the previous year, and that vintage year would be no longer subject to recapture. Different commentators have provided different comments along the lines of the recapture rules, but almost all of them that I noticed going through the comments are around an agreement that the mass balance approach is really the approach that should be adopted, and the fact that an operator in an oil field is very well equipped to understand, if they have an MRV plan in place, they're very well equipped to determine what's happening in the field or the sequestration site, and so therefore there should be a very short period of recapture risk associated with it. So next slide, please. Beginning of construction. So this is an issue that's come up, of course, particularly in the context of the wind and solar tax credits, which are similar to the production tax credit that Michael mentioned earlier. That this is in fact modeled as a production tax credit, and so there are rules that were adopted with respect to those technologies, and so the service asked and for whether there should be guidance on this subject, and the Carbon Capture Coalition essentially provided model guidance that more or less adopted the previous rules that are contained in other revenue procedures that the service put out with respect to wind and solar. However, they do suggest some longer lead times as compared to those technologies because of the difficulties and long time elements associated with engineering, permitting, financing, constructing carbon capture projects. Having guidance that's modeled after other energy tax credits, I think everyone in the industry believes that would be a very constructive thing for the service to adopt. Next slide, please. Structures. So this is what I mentioned earlier in my introductory slide. There's a question regarding the structures under which project developers and participating investors would be respected as partners in a partnership generating a Section 45Q tax credit. And what this is really getting at is the fact that you can't just sell a tax credit. You actually have to be in a bona fide partnership. There has to be economic risk for partners in that partnership and an underlying business, even if that business would not be profitable without the tax credit. We've seen these rules adopted not only in the context of wind and solar, but also the refined coal tax credit. And the coalition did in fact ask that for clarifying guidance and other types of clarification from the Internal Revenue Service around this very technical area. Next slide, please. Utilization. This is a new area of 45Q regarding utilization of CO2. Again, this is more or less what occurs when you're not putting it into secure geologic storage, but you're really you're using chemical processes such as photosynthesis and chemosynthesis, algae, bacteria, and the service is asking about guidance relative to how you establish when these types of processes qualify for the tax credit. And this is a very technical area, but the Carbon Capture Coalition did provide model guidance relative to how a life cycle analysis would occur to determine whether there is fixation of CO2, and it gets into a very, very detailed model of what the life cycle analysis should look like. I don't think it really serves a great purpose to go too much into detail about this, but essentially what the Carbon Capture Coalition is looking for is a methodologies that are neutral in type, that it doesn't favor one technology over another, that you begin with the carbon dioxide molecules, how they are acquired, and then finally that it has to be a measurement and an LCA that is transparent and clear to taxpayers, so that there's no confusion or difficulties in actually taking the credit. Next slide, please.
Oh, I guess I will take over from here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the process and the timing of what we're likely to see in upcoming guidance. As Michael and Hunter have mentioned, the notice requesting comments 2019-32 was issued towards the end of May, and the comments were due roughly 45 days later, July 4th of 2019. Thus far, and it's actually 94 comments have been filed. One of them was apparently duplicative or something, and it had been removed from the site. But there's a number of comments. That's a large number of comments for tax guidance. And I understand that other comments were filed but not yet posted. And the comments have been filed from a number of stakeholders, including industry coalitions, environmental groups, utilization startups, state and local governments, researchers, oil and gas companies and EOR companies, and even lawyers, accountants, and other consultants. And so there's a wide range of interests that are reflected in the comments. And so hopefully the government will be getting some really good feedback with which to draft the next stage of guidance. Historically, the guidance in the energy space has been done through sub-regulatory guidance. We've seen mostly notices, as evidenced by the former 45Q guidance, which is in Notice 2009-83, and was modified by Notice 2011-25. Even though a lot of those notices, if you go back and read them for the various energy credits, say regulations will say, but they've never gone back and actually promulgated the regulations. They've let the notices stand. This administration really does not like to govern through notices and through other sub-regulatory guidance. So we are likely to see proposed regulations issued that take into account these various comments and incorporate the prior guidance out there. And that has the benefit of allowing everybody a second notice and comment period. So I suspect it's going to take at least several months to get proposed regulations completed. My understanding is that they are not confining themselves to the schedule that was implemented for TCJA guidance. They actually, for the TCJA guidance for each project, they had scheduled when various pieces of the guidance would be issued, and they worked to that schedule. And I understand that this is not going to follow the same kind of model, so it's not likely to be as expedited, unfortunately. But at the same time, this guidance has to be coordinated with other agencies, and so they're going to need more time, I think, to get the proposed regulations out there. Once the proposed regulations are issued, we'll have at least 30 days, probably more like 60 or 90 days for notice and comment period before they issue, and then they'll work on the final regulations. I have on this slide other sub-regulatory guidance question mark. Some of the areas that Hunter talked about have traditionally been done using sub-regulatory guidance. For example, there are revenue procedures that provide safe harbors for certain types of partnership terms that will be respected. So, the wind energy production area and the rehabilitation investment tax credit, those revenue procedures set forth safe harbors that if your partnership agreement satisfies these terms, you will be respected as a partner. You will be treated as having the benefits and burdens of the partnership, and be subject to the risks and rewards, and be respected as a partner. Those have been historically done in sub-regulatory guidance. Given this administration's preference for regulations, we may see that type of guidance incorporated in the proposed regulations. Similarly, the begin construction guidance has historically been done through notices, and that is also likely to be incorporated into the proposed regulations. The notice specifically says that in the interim, the prior guidance can be relied on, although, as discussed, the prior guidance doesn't address any of the new stuff in the Bipartisan Budget Act, and so that will just have to be, based on some reasonable interpretation of the statute. So until we have actually, I suspect when they issue proposed regulations, they will permit reliance on those proposed regulations. But in the interim, there'll be some uncertainty as we go down that road.
Okay.
Did I miss anything?
I think that covers the STEPTO part of the webinar.
Yeah, I think we're going to open it to questions at this point.
Kara?
Thanks.
Thank you.
I'm
Sorry,
going
is that Kara or Kara?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Commissioner.
Thank you. Thank you very much for those great presentations. That was really helpful. Maybe I'll ask a question or two to get things kicked off, but if you have a question, please raise your hand as Chairman Oden had indicated, and we'll get your questions answered. Given the process that we're still in to try to get the guidance issued, and I don't know if you gave us an actual estimate of when you think that might happen.
To get final guidance issued, or just the proposed guidance?
Final guidance.
Final guidance, my guess would be you're talking probably a couple of years before you see the final regulations. I mean, it's hard to predict because any number of things can happen and slow things down or speed things up. But I think at this point, what we're probably hoping for is proposed regulations that give reliance so that deals can start going forward.
So this is Hunter Johnston. I just reemphasize that there's a lot of uncertainty exactly what their timeline was. There was a big delay in just getting the comments out. As Lisa said, although they seem to have a preference for regulations, we're not completely confident they're going to go that route. They could go a guidance route. But I think that there's an expectation and a hope in the carbon capture community that they issue something by the end of the year. That would probably take the form of proposed regulations or interim guidance. But in my conversations with the Internal Revenue Service, at least prior to the comment period, was that was more or less the timetable that they were looking at. But as Lisa mentioned, final guidance is going to take quite a bit. Final regulations would take quite a bit longer.
Do you think the interim guidance would be sufficient to start getting these projects moving and the financing in place?
So I would say that there are a lot of projects that are moving forward in real time to get financed this year. The 45Q as a tax credit has been around since 2009, and I think about 60 million tons of the 75 million ton limit has been taken by taxpayers. So there's certainly certainty in the market with respect to 45Q and kind of what the basic terms of the statute are. However, some of these more technical issues, and if you're dealing, for instance, with the tax equity transaction, if you're trying to get financed right now, you would probably ask for a private letter ruling or some additional information from the service to support the transaction if you're trying to move forward this year.
And the IRS does not have to issue a private letter ruling. It is discretionary on the part of the IRS to issue it, but they have not come out and said that they will not issue them. So.
And I mean, to that point, they're also trying to avoid issuing PLRs for every project that wants to get financed by adopting rules that are transparent, that everybody understands. And, you know, because of the new features of the law, this transferability and recapture becomes so important because it's a 12-year credit, as opposed to the aggregate credit that would just look back, you know, to each year that you did the activity. In this case, what you're trying to do is ensure that when you're, you know, before you've even constructed your project, that you know that you're confident that you can get your tax credit for 12 years if you meet the 2024 beginning construction test. So that's why the guidance is really so important, is just making sure that whatever the structure is that you've adopted, for whether it's a project finance or otherwise, that you're able to, you know, that you have certainty that you're going to be able to get that tax credit.
That makes sense. Given the delay in getting final guidance or the final regulation, is there talk in the legislative component to push that construction commencement date of January 1st, 2024?
That's a very interesting issue. Yes, within the Carbon Capture Coalition, there's been a lot of discussion about that, and people complaining that we've lost 16 months, as Michael pointed out. But of course, you know, getting a tax credit extended gets into the legislative trick bag of what's an extender and when is an extender ready for extension. And by the current test that the House Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee have adopted for extending tax credits, a tax credit which expires in 2024 is not yet ripe for extension. So, you know, I know you might say only in Washington, but that's sort of where we are today with on that issue.
Thank you. It seems sort of a chicken and the egg kind of problem, though, if they're going to have trouble getting things financed because that window is coming too soon. But I understand they can't extend it until it gets a little bit closer, but it seems like that would have a negative impact on potential projects.
I agree with you. Carbon capture projects take a long time to put together, and the permitting relative to the Safe Drinking Water Act, which is necessary if you're going to use saline storage or EOR, that can be very it can take a lot of time, and those permits, particularly as it relates to Class 6, which is non-EOR sequestration, only one or two have ever been granted. So the timetable relative to that basically would mean that you have to be in permitting coincidental to your construction in order to meet the date. But it is a beginning construction date, not a placed in service date. So that is a little bit helpful. But I agree. I think a lot of people are concerned about the issue that you just put your finger on.
Thanks. I'll maybe ask one more question and see if Kira has any interest from anybody else on the webinar. And I don't know if this relates or not, but I know at the commission we've been getting a lot of wind projects coming in to make sure that they're eligible for 100% PTCs. And in that process, there have been sort of safe harbor provisions of PTCs related to the commencement of construction or commencement of the project, ordering of turbines, for example, or other things like that. Are there any similar provisions in this bill that would allow for safe harbor or in these regulations?
There are currently no rules, but I think we anticipate that similar rules will be implemented for the carbon capture sequestration credit. In fact, a lot of the commenters had actually marked up the wind and the solar guidance on begin construction to modify it for carbon capture.
Yeah, you'll notice in the comments of the Carbon Capture Coalition, and actually there's another group that submitted comments, I think something called the Complete Regulatory Project or something like that. They focused a lot of work in this area, and they did follow the wind PTC rules on the 5% safe harbor, for instance, the physical work test, and other elements, continuous efforts test, all those different parts of that revenue procedure that you're referring to from the wind, that'd be done in the context of carbon capture.
Interesting. Thank you very much. Kira, do you have anyone that would like to ask a question?
Yes, we did have a question come in from the audience. I think this is aimed more at Hunter and Lisa, although Michael can feel free to chime in. Going back to the couple of slides that you had on transfer, the question is, can an owner of capture equipment transfer or sell a portion of the 45Q credits in any 1 year to an unrelated party? Or is that part of the model guidance that the Carbon Capture Coalition put together?
So there's a nuance on this, and I know that Michael he could give you the answer just as well as I can. But the transfer provision in 45Q allows the transfer to the person who physically disposes of the CO2. That part is clear. So if you have another person who's actually doing the disposal of the CO2, it's very clear that person can take the credit. Part of the recommendations of the Carbon Capture Coalition, however, was that the statute should be read a little more flexibly, and that you could transfer the tax credit to the person who has contractual responsibility to dispose of the CO2. So I wouldn't say that person would be a completely unrelated party if they have contractual responsibility, but you could imagine someone, a third party, being involved in that chain with contractual responsibility that's not actually doing the actual disposal of the CO2. That's a person around which a tax equity transaction could be constructed. And that's what the Carbon Capture Coalition comments were asking the service to adopt, that flexible interpretation.
Thank you. Commissioner, we don't have any other audience questions. I think we might have time for one more from you before wrapping up.
Well, I think I'm actually pretty good on my list. So I think I would just thank the panelists for your presentations. I don't know if Chairman Oden would like to say any closing remarks.
I'm afraid he is muted. Sorry about that, but I would certainly reiterate Commissioner Fornstrom's thanks to all the panelists for speaking today. This webinar has been recorded. It will be posted on NARUC's YouTube channel, and the presentation will be available on naruc.org/CPI. And we will be planning some additional webinars on carbon capture and issues around coal use throughout the year, so please stay tuned. And Commissioner Oden, would you like to add anything to wrap up?
Yeah, my app sort of muted me by mistake, but that's fine. Yeah, and we want to thank you all, Michael and Lisa and Hunter, for doing your presentations. That was very informative, and we thank you for that, and we thank you for the time you've spent on that. And as Kira said, these will be available, and so please do that. Let me plug NARUC. This coming up next week, we will have 2 different sessions at NARUC. I think Kara is hosting one, and I'm hosting one. So if you're at NARUC, please join us for those conversations as well. Thank you, everyone.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Have a good afternoon.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Goodbye.